12. The firefighter said it quietly at first, like he didn't quite believe it. And then again, louder, until half the trauma bay turned to look. Kate Doyle stood there, soot to the elbows. A stranger's weight still aching in her shoulders. A woman in labor's hand locked around hers. And for the first time in 9 years, somebody in this building had just called her by a name that actually fit. Nobody at Fairview Memorial had ever asked Kate Doyle a real question about herself. In the next few seconds, all of them would. Nobody at Fairview Memorial ever really looked at Kate Doyle. 4 years there, and she'd built every one of them around making sure of it. Fairview was a mid-size community hospital, one trauma bay, most nights spent on falls and chest pain rather than anything that made the news. Kate had picked it on purpose. 39 years old, steady hands, a reputation for being reliable, in the kind of unremarkable way nobody ever writes a commendation for. A monitor alarm went off in 214 that morning, a post-op patient's oxygen dropping fast, his color already wrong by the time Kate reached the door. She had him repositioned and on a non-rebreather before the rapid response team's footsteps hit the hallway. By the time the resident arrived, the patient was stable and Kate was back at the med cart, checking a different chart. Like she'd simply been standing nearby. Doyle caught it, a tech told the resident, who nodded and moved on. And nobody wrote it down anywhere. Kate preferred it that way. 20 minutes after that, a 7-year-old came through with a dislocated shoulder from a bike accident, screaming every time anyone came near him. His mother was crying harder than he was. Kate knelt down to his level instead of leaning over him, talked to him about the bike and not the shoulder, and had it back in the socket and the boy laughing about something else entirely before he understood what had happened. "How did you do that without hurting him?" the mother asked, stunned. "Distraction," Kate said, which was true, and also not the whole answer. Because a body that's used to working fast under someone else's panic doesn't need long to work fast under a child's. Fairview ran on a rotating shift schedule that put Kate on days more often than not that month, which meant she saw more of the hospital's daylight rhythms than its night ones. The vending machine restock at 9. The chaplain's rounds at 11. The particular quiet of a floor between crises. She'd arranged her whole life around exactly that kind of quiet. It suited her, and it had taken her most of the last 9 years to believe that it actually could. "You're doing it again." Gail Prentice said it from 3 feet away, loud enough for the 2 techs restocking the medroom to hear. Kate had her sleeve pressed to her mouth. One dry cough caught and swallowed before it became 2. "Dry air in here." Kate straightened, arms folded, waiting for it to pass. 3rd time this week. Gail opened the black spiral notebook clipped to her lanyard, not a hospital form, just a plain notebook, and wrote something without looking up. "I have to think about patient safety, Kate. A nurse who can't get a full breath in a code isn't someone I can keep signing off for high acuity. I've never missed a code. Not yet." Gail closed the notebook. "That's the part that worries me. I'd hate for the board to ask why I kept assigning high acuity cases to someone with a documented respiratory concern, and not have an answer ready. Then don't document a concern. Ask a pulmonologist. I don't need a specialist to hear what I just heard." Gail slid the notebook back onto her lanyard clip. "I'm not trying to be unkind, Kate. I'm trying to run a safe floor." It wasn't concern in her voice anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. She walked off toward the nurses' station, where Priscilla Nakamura, who ran the unit's schedule and said good morning to every nurse by name, gave Kate a small, apologetic look and didn't say anything either. Gail had run this floor for 6 years, and everyone on it knew she wanted the director of nursing seat opening that spring. Knew it from the committee work, the color-coded binders, the way she said asterisk, patient safety, asterisk like she'd trademarked it. Fewer people had noticed the second notebook. The one that wasn't about metrics at all. Kate went back to the crash cart in Bay 4, counting the drawers by feel before she even looked at them. On her way past the supply closet, she pressed the back of her hand flat against the door for half a second. Not turning the handle, just checking. She didn't notice she'd done it. Nobody on that floor had ever once seen her open a door she hadn't checked first. Nobody had ever thought to ask why. At lunch, Theo caught her alone at the vending machine and said, quietly, "For what it's worth, I don't think you sound any different than you did a year ago." Nobody else had bothered to say that much all week. Kate thanked him for it in the same flat, careful voice she used for everything. Keeping the gratitude small, the way she kept most things small in a hallway where Gail might hear it. Reaching for a box of gauze on the top shelf a minute later, her sleeve slid back long enough for Gail, passing behind her, to catch sight of a thin white scar tracking up her forearm. "Where's that from?" Gail asked, more curious than kind. Kate tugged her sleeve back down. "Old scar." She didn't offer anything else, and for once, Gail didn't push. The high acuity board update came an hour later. Gail posted the assignments herself, which she didn't usually bother to do, and moved Kate off the trauma bay and onto discharge paperwork in the same flat voice she used for everything. "You're on paperwork for the rest of the shift," Gail said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I want somebody in the trauma bay I know can hold up if things get long." Theo Banks, restocking 2 feet away, opened his mouth. "She's held up fine every other." "I didn't ask, Theo." Gail didn't raise her voice. She never had to. "I'm just saying, if it's about the cough. It's about patient safety. That's the only thing it's ever about." Gail didn't look up from the assignment sheet. Theo closed his mouth. 2 years next to Kate, and he'd never once seen her fumble a code. He filed it away instead of saying it twice. Kate took the folder without a word. If anyone had been watching her hands instead of her face, they'd have seen they were completely steady. The fire alarm testing crew came through at 4, propping doors, running the panel zone by zone. A blast of the horn went off 2 feet from the nurse's station without warning, and half the floor flinched. Kate didn't. She was already up. Already counting exits. 3 steps toward the stairwell door before the second blast told her it was only a test. "You move fast for a drill," Theo said, half a joke, watching her sit back down. Old habit. She didn't say which one, and he didn't ask twice. Gail noticed too. She watched Kate settle back into her chair a beat too fast. The way a person settles when they're pretending something didn't just happen. And wrote nothing down about that one, because it didn't fit the story she was already building. She went home a little after 7, made herself dinner from whatever was in the fridge, and did the small things she did every night without thinking of them as a ritual. Checked that the hallway smoke detector's light was still blinking green. Checked the deadbolt twice. And glanced, the way she always did, at the 2 clear paths out of her 3rd-floor apartment. The front door and the fire escape bolted to the outside of her bedroom window, which she'd tested for smooth operation on the day she moved in, and never mentioned to anyone since. Then she opened the hall closet, moved 2 coats aside, and looked at the folded turnout coat still sitting on the shelf where she'd put it 9 years ago. Faded navy. A company number stitched above the pocket. For a moment it wasn't a closet at all. It was a stairwell gone black to the ceiling. A mask seal cracked at the worst possible second. Her own breathing loud enough to drown out the radio. And then someone else's hands finding her in the dark. She'd walked out of that building on her own 2 feet. Her lungs never fully came back. The letter from the medical board had been blunter than the memory. Not qualified to return to full duty. Permanent. Months of rehab had bought back most of her capacity and none of her clearance. And there's no partial credit for a finding like that. After the letter came nursing school. The only version of helping people that didn't ask anything of her lungs they couldn't give. A photo stood propped in the corner of the shelf. Faces in matching turnout gear. And there was Kate Doyle, younger, laughing at something out of frame. The rest of the picture turned just far enough into shadow that it kept its own secrets. The way she'd learned to. She closed the closet. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying about this a long time ago, on a schedule that had nothing to do with Gail Prentice. And Gail's notebook, whatever it thought it knew, didn't know the first thing about what that cough had cost to earn. Her phone buzzed on the counter, her sister, 3 states away, checking in the way she did every couple of weeks. "You sound tired," her sister said. "Everything okay at the hospital?" Kate said it was fine, the way she always said it was fine. And didn't mention Gail, or the notebook, or the assignment board. Because there wasn't a version of that conversation that didn't end with her sister asking the one question Kate had spent 9 years making sure nobody got to ask. She said good night instead, and meant it. And went to bed with the hallway light left on, the way she always left it. The smoke alarm in the 3rd floor hallway went off at 11:40, and for 4 seconds Kate registered it as background noise. Smoke alarms in that building went off for burnt toast twice a month. Then she smelled it under her own door. And every part of her that had spent 9 years being quiet stood up at once. She was in the hallway in under a minute, barefoot, phone jammed in her waistband and already dialing 911. While her other hand found the wall and followed it. Smoke banking down from the ceiling. Already thicker than toast. Black instead of gray. Rolling and folding back on itself the way smoke does right before a room gives up all its heat at once. She read it without deciding to read it. Whatever was burning wasn't burning slow. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed and footsteps pounded toward the stairs. Other tenants, awake now, moving on instinct instead of information. Nobody stopped to check on anyone else. Kate didn't blame them for it. Panic does what it does. And most people had never been trained to do anything else with it. 3rd floor, north stairwell, smoke showing, working fire, she told the dispatcher. Already moving toward 3C, counting doors as she went the way she used to count them on a hose line. Out loud in her own head if nowhere else. The dispatcher asked her to confirm her own unit number and whether she was safely out of the building. She said she'd call back, and didn't. Because there wasn't going to be a version of the next 4 minutes where she was anywhere but exactly where she was. 4 miles away, Gail Prentice was closing out her shift. Adding one more line to the black notebook before she clipped it back to her lanyard. A note about a cough, dated that afternoon, filed under a name that meant nothing to anyone else in the building. She had no way of knowing that the name belonged to someone currently crawling down a smoke-filled hallway on her hands and knees. She wouldn't find out for another hour. Bernard Okafor's door was cool under her palm, top and bottom both. The fire hadn't reached his unit yet. But the hallway outside was already a haze she couldn't see through, heat radiating off the wall shared with the apartment past his. She went in low, calling his name. Found him in his recliner, disoriented, cane knocked over, unable to stand without it. "Bernie, we're leaving now. Hold my collar, stay low, don't stand up." She didn't wait for him to agree. "My cane," Bernie said, reaching for the floor. "I can't leave I've got you. Leave it." She was already looking past him for something better than his own 2 legs. He was heavier than he looked, and his knees weren't going to hold a walking pace through a hallway they couldn't see across. She pulled the throw blanket off his recliner, wrapped it under his arms, and dragged him to the stairwell door on it like a sled. Her own head below the worst of the smoke and his lower still. Counting doorways by touch because the hall lights had already died. "You're doing good, Bernie. Just breathe low with me." He was, in fact, doing exactly what she asked without needing to be told twice. Which was more than she could say for most people half his age in the same amount of smoke. The stairwell door was the only thing standing between the hallway and air still worth breathing. And she pulled it shut behind them out of reflex before she'd consciously decided to. Behind it, muffled. A low, expanding roar. Glass giving way somewhere down the hall. A room going from bad to unsurvivable, and the door the only reason it hadn't followed them out. She got Bernie down 2 flights and folded him into a neighbor's arms in the lobby. He grabbed her sleeve once, hard. Go back for the others. I'm fine, go. She was already moving before he finished the sentence. One stairwell fed every unit above the 2nd floor. Which meant anyone still up there was coming down through the same 6 feet of space she'd just come down through. Or they weren't coming down at all. She turned back toward the stairwell instead of the exit. Because Sana Malhotra lived on 5, and Kate hadn't heard her come down. She found her on the landing between 4 and 5. One hand braced against the wall, doubled over, contractions coming hard and close, 6 weeks early. Panic and smoke pulling her breathing into short, useless pulls. Sana's phone had slipped from her hand a few steps above. Kate scooped it up without breaking stride and shoved it into the same waistband as her own. Sana, look at me. Not the smoke, me. Kate crouched to her eye level. Your body's doing what it's supposed to do. We're going down together, breathing low, under the smoke, like this. She showed her, and Sana copied her, and it worked. The air 2 feet off the ground was still clear enough to hold onto. The next contraction hit on the 3rd step down, 40 seconds long, barely 2 minutes since the last one. Sana's knees buckled. Kate got an arm under her. Is something wrong with her? With the baby? Panic and smoke both do this. It doesn't mean something's wrong. It means we move. By the 2nd flight the contractions were 90 seconds apart, and Kate stopped pretending either of them had time to wait it out. I can't do the stairs and this at the same time. Sana's voice had gone thin. The particular thinness of someone who's stopped believing her own body will cooperate. You've been doing both for 4 flights already. You're better at this than you think. Kate kept one hand at the small of her back, steering more than supporting, timing each contraction the instant it started instead of waiting to be sure. One more flight. Then it's just people whose whole job is this. Kate's own chest had started pulling tight somewhere around the 4th flight. 9 years of scar tissue reminding her exactly how much borrowed time she was running on without a mask. She matched her breathing to Sana's anyway. Slow counts in, longer counts out. Less because Sana needed the coaching, and more because she needed to prove to her own lungs that they still remembered how. They came out the ground floor door into cold air and red emergency light just as the first engine rounded the corner. A firefighter reached them first, radio already up. She's in active labor, 90 seconds apart, and I've had her in that smoke for 10 minutes, Kate said, before he could ask a single question. Get her on high-flow oxygen and keep it on both of them. Pulse ox lies after a fire like this, and the baby needs it longer than she does. He looked at her half a second too long. Copy that, he said, and moved. Behind them, an incident commander's voice cut across a dozen radios at once. All companies, defensive posture, nobody goes back inside that stairwell. Somewhere in the noise, Kate registered, distantly, that she used to be the one giving that order. Not the one hearing it from the outside. She didn't say any of that out loud. She kept counting Sana's breathing until the ambulance doors opened. Bernie, wrapped in a foil blanket by then and refusing to be loaded into a second rig without seeing her first, caught her sleeve as the crew swapped patients between units. You went back up for her, he said, not quite a question. After you already had me down. Kate didn't answer that one either. She just made sure his gurney straps were tight before she let anyone move him. Fairview's ambulance bay took all 3 of them within minutes of each other. Bernie first, oxygen mask already on him in the rig. Sana next, contractions on top of each other. Kate last, walking in on her own feet, refusing the gurney, coughing in a way that had stopped being dry somewhere on the 2nd staircase. Gail was at the charge desk when the doors opened. She looked up because everyone looked up. And what she saw first was Kate Doyle, soot to the elbows, hair matted with sweat. walking a woman in labor through triage with one hand and calling vitals over her shoulder like she'd done this 1,000 times. She had just never here. Primap, 6 weeks early, contractions 90 seconds apart since the stairwell, on high-flow oxygen since the scene. Keep it on both of them. Kate told the OB nurse jogging to meet them, and kept walking. Gail fell in a step behind them, saying nothing, notebook still clipped to her lanyard. The firefighter who'd ridden in with them, Marcus Yun, jacket still damp, smelling like a building that had just changed shape, froze when he got a clear look at Kate under the trauma bay lights. Her sleeve had ridden up over the arm she'd used to brace Bernie's weight. And high on it, near the shoulder, a small faded numeral sat half under an old burn scar. He'd seen that mark before. A different sleeve, a different fire, years before this one. 12. He said it like he wasn't sure until it was already out. Doyle, you're. He looked at the badge on her scrubs, then back at her face. You're a nurse. Here. 4 years now, Kate said, already moving Sana onto a gurney, not stopping for the conversation he clearly wanted. He caught her arm, gently, once. Careful in a way that told her he already knew exactly how much force her lungs could take and exactly how much this had cost her. You went in without a mask. With your lungs. There wasn't a mask in the building, and there was about 90 seconds. You'd have made the same call and you know it. I'd have made it with an SCBA on my back. Something in his voice made it clear the number on her arm had never stopped meaning something to him. You taught half of us how to read a stairwell before we ever touched a hose line. You taught me, personally, the day I almost went through a floor that wasn't there anymore. He looked around, at Gail, at Theo, at the 2 techs who'd stopped pretending not to listen. She ran rescued 12 for 6 years. Captain, the last 2. Warehouse collapse on Meridian took her lungs. Nobody told me she ended up here. One of the techs, a younger woman named Priya who'd been at Fairview less than a year, said what half the room was thinking. Wait, you're saying Doyle used to run into buildings for a living? I'm saying Doyle used to run into buildings and pull people who were worse off than that man on the gurney back there, Yun said. For 6 years. And nobody here apparently thought to ask her about it. Nobody asked, Kate said. And pushed Sana's gurney through the double doors, Theo falling in beside her without needing to be told. Theo waited until they were through. The paperwork thing tonight, that makes a lot more sense now. He didn't dress it up as anything more than that, and Kate didn't need him to. Gail stood very still by the charge desk. And for the first time in 2 years, didn't reach for the notebook. Sana delivered 19 minutes later, 6 weeks early, a daughter, both of them stable. She'd wanted her husband there, and Kate had made sure someone called him from the hallway phone the moment there was a spare hand to do it. The baby spent her first day under a warming lamp in the NICU before anyone let Sana hold her properly. By the second day, she didn't need it anymore. Bernie's oxygen came up within the hour, smoke inhalation and nothing worse. And he spent most of that hour asking anyone who'd listen where the nurse who'd carried him out had gone. Kate's numbers took longer. The team ran a carboxyhemoglobin level instead of trusting the pulse ox on her finger. The same thing she'd told them to do for Sana. And it came back high enough that the attending kept her on high-flow oxygen for hours past what her SATs alone would have justified. Theo ran her labs himself instead of paging it out. The attending listened to her lungs longer than the exam strictly required. And told her, in the flat voice doctors use for things they already suspect the patient knows, that she'd need a pulmonology follow-up before she came back to a floor. Kate nodded. There wasn't anything in that sentence she hadn't already lived through once. For what it's worth, the attending added, pulling off her stethoscope. Whatever you did out there tonight, your lungs paid for every bit of it. I hope somebody tells you that's not the same thing as being careless. Kate didn't have a ready answer for that one. So she just nodded again, and let the oxygen do the talking for a while. She sat with the mask on her own face for a long time and said almost nothing. Because there wasn't anything left to hide anymore, and it turned out that took its own kind of getting used to. Theo came by twice more than he needed to, checking a chart he'd already checked. And the second time, he set a pair of hospital socks on the end of her bed without a word. Because somewhere between the ambulance bay and here, somebody had finally noticed she'd done all of it barefoot. Gail stood in the doorway of Bay 6 for a long moment, and didn't come in. By morning, a neighbor's phone video of Kate dragging Bernie down on a blanket had 1.1 million views. And a caption identifying her, correctly, as Rescue Company 12's former captain. By 6, the local station ran it at the top of the broadcast. Yun on camera, out of his gear, calling her one of the best interior firefighters he'd ever worked under. And adding that she'd gone in without a mask because there hadn't been time to get one. Kate was one more name on the Red Cross's list of displaced tenants that week, though she spent more of it in a hospital gown than a cot. Yun found her in Bay 6 before his shift ended and set something on the end of the gurney without a word. Her old turnout coat, smoke-stained but whole, pulled from the one closet in the building the fire never reached. The committee deciding the next director of nursing met that same week, already scheduled months out. Gail walked in with the black notebook she'd kept for 2 years. Sure of it the way people are sure of things they've never had to defend out loud. She hadn't watched the news that morning. She'd been up since 5 rehearsing her pitch instead. Early documentation, she told them. Pattern recognition. I flagged a respiratory concern and managed the risk accordingly. Priscilla Nakamura, who'd watched the same footage as everyone else that morning, turned 2 pages without a word. A cough noted. An assignment quietly reduced. The same pattern, month after month. Right up until the day before the fire. She read one date out loud. Then the date of the news clip beside it. And let the 2 numbers sit next to each other in the silence instead of explaining what they meant. Nobody said anything for a beat too long. Gail. Nakamura closed the notebook. You documented a former fire captain's service-connected injury for 2 years. And used it to keep her off cases she was fully capable of running. That's not risk management. That's 2 years this hospital should have spent finding her an accommodation, instead of a reason to push her out. I've already talked to 2 of the techs who work that floor. Their account of things doesn't leave much room to argue the point. Gail didn't have an answer. There wasn't one that sounded like anything else. She didn't get the seat. The committee gave it to someone else within the week. And nobody explained the decision to her out loud, because nobody had to. Gail kept her job. She kept running the floor exactly the way she always had. And Kate kept working under her, and neither of them ever mentioned the notebook again. Some things don't end with a scene. They just end with a door that stays a little more closed than it used to. Kate spent those 2 weeks in a corporate extended stay a mile from the hospital. Insurance paperwork for the building's fire claim spread across a desk that wasn't hers. And went back to a normal shift cleared by pulmonology, cough and all. Theo didn't say anything about the notebook, or Gail, or any of it. He just moved the crash cart restocked to her side of the unit without being asked. Sana brought the baby by on her first follow-up, 3 weeks old. I named her Maple, she said. After the street. Then, quieter. Thank you doesn't cover it, but it's what I've got. Bernie came by twice that first month too, cane and all. Mostly to tell the story of the woman who wrapped him up like a burrito, a little more embellished every time he told it. Before he transferred to a different station that spring, Yun stopped by once more. Out of uniform. Standing in the doorway of the break room the way people do when they're not sure they're welcome. The Academy's short an instructor for the Interior Tactics module, he said. Reading smoke. Reading a stairwell. The stuff nobody teaches until somebody almost dies learning it the hard way. I gave them your name. I probably should have asked first. You probably should have. Will you do it? Kate didn't answer right away. She still hasn't, not all the way. But she took the card he held out, and she didn't put it in a drawer. And that was more of an answer than either of them said out loud. She still checks doors with the back of her hand. She still doesn't talk about the number on her arm unless someone else brings it up first. But she stopped hiding the cough. And stopped pretending it embarrassed her when it caught her mid-sentence at the nurse's station. It had never been the weakness anyone made it out to be. It was just the part of the bill she was still paying, 9 years later, for a night that had nothing to do with any hospital at all. I know a version of Kate. You probably do too. Someone whose limp, or scar, or cough, or bad year on paper got read as the whole story, instead of what it actually was. Proof of something they'd survived. It's easy to mistake the cost of helping someone once for a weakness in the person who paid it. Those aren't the same thing. And most of us have gotten that wrong about somebody without ever finding out. So here's the only question I've got. Who have you underestimated for something that was actually proof of what they'd already survived? And have you ever told them you got it wrong? If this one got to you, that's Hidden Stretch. Hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and tell us in the comments.